This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Frannies Pharmacy.
Now more than ever, it's important that our society focuses more on our mental and physical health. At Frannies Pharmacy, the team is committed to their community's need of being happy, healthy, and stress-free. Come learn how Frannies Pharmacy can assist you in a clean, professional environment with their expert bud tenders that are excited to educate you about the benefits of their lab-tested, DEA-certified CBD products. Frannies Pharmacy also offers wholesale and franchise opportunities. Visit their website at franniespharmacy.com, and that's pharmacy with an F, and use the promo code CannaConnect10 for an exclusive Cannabinoid Connect discount. Again, that's Frannies Pharmacy with an F.com and use the promo code CannaConnect10 for an exclusive Cannabinoid Connect discount. Frannies Pharmacy, putting the farm back into pharmacy. Louis, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for taking time for me in the audience today. Really excited to be talking to you about your role as Chief Strategy Officer at Metrc. But before we do that, Louis, let's get to know you a bit. So tell me, where are you located? Where are you based?
Yeah, so I'm currently based just outside Tampa, Florida, about halfway between Tampa and Orlando, and I office out of Lakeland, Florida.
Got you. Is that are you a native Floridian or?
No, I am absolutely new to Florida. I spent most of my life in Colorado, where I spent most of my career. In fact, that's where I got my start in the cannabis industry, was in Colorado, first as a member of law enforcement, and then in various roles with the state when we started legalizing cannabis, which I'm happy to go into more, of course.
Yeah, no, that's exactly a perfect segue, because that was kind of how I wanted to kick this conversation off. Is you have the unique position of, now, as I mentioned, being Chief Strategy Officer with Metrc, where, y'all are really helping cannabis operators navigate through the regulatory process state by state, which can be a headache, right? But you've also been on the other side, where you've actually been in law enforcement and a regulator within Colorado. So, why don't you talk us through your career in law enforcement as a regulator back in, I believe, in 2010, and how you oversaw the development and implementation of cannabis policy for the medical industry there.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think if I were to just summarize my career, I've been really blessed, for one, and it's been because I've got experience in kind of a combination of law enforcement, but also, as you mentioned, spent some time as a regulator, working as the executive for the state of Colorado. But I also have an academic background. I have a PhD in public policy, but I also have a master's in business administration, kind of focused on international business. And now I've got a handful of years operating on the commercial side, or the business side of things. And so when I think about all of those, I'm reminded of just how fortunate I've been to apply and kind of gain a lot of those experiences in the cannabis industry. And so I certainly started my career on the law enforcement side, which was really kind of focused more on the criminal enforcement of drug policy. When I transitioned from a local jurisdiction just outside of the city of Denver to a state agency that regulated casino gambling, I really started to evolve my thinking a lot about the relationship.
Just to slow you down a bit, though, I mean, before you jump past, your experience in law enforcement, what was that like? I mean, being on that side and, specifically with cannabis, right? And dealing with criminals in that regard.
Well, so my perspective is that all of those roles are really important and still important today, right?
Sure.
And while I think the focus has certainly been shifting away from criminal enforcement when it comes to cannabis, I still think that law enforcement plays a really important role in how cannabis legalization continues to evolve over time. And so I think, when I look back at those experiences, they were all part of the building blocks of what kind of formulated my opinion around cannabis and cannabis legalization. And more importantly, how can businesses that operate in a heavily regulated environment or a comprehensively regulated environment partner with government to get government the data that they need to evaluate whether or not government's meeting its goals. And so certainly being part of law enforcement was a critical component of that, but it all kind of was one part of the building blocks that got me to where I am today.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, this podcast, we've had Kyle Kazan on, who also has a history in law enforcement, and he talked through it. And, we're definitely not a defund the police kind of podcast here. Definitely support law enforcement and the great things that police officers do. It's just like, it's got to be a weird position to be in, right? Like knowing like what you know now, and like you mentioned, though, it's all building blocks kind of leading up to this point. And you mentioned data and law enforcement working and partnering with government. I mean, did you see a lot of that happening when you were in law enforcement? Is that getting better by any means? Like, how much do law enforcement and the government talk when shaping policy?
Well, I think they talk a lot, right? I mean, they're essentially both government entities, and law enforcement certainly has a lot to add into the conversation when it comes to public policy. But I think they also have a lot to learn. I mentioned to you earlier that I worked towards my PhD during some of the work that I did in Colorado for the legalization of cannabis, and some of the research I did went back and looked at law enforcement's involvement in the rulemaking process. And out of all the different stakeholders that I talked to during that research, which was industry owners, regulators, public health officials, city officials, law enforcement, et cetera, law enforcement was like one of the first to acknowledge that they learned a lot during the rulemaking process that they hadn't thought about before. And so I think in a lot of ways, well, it's certainly there's certainly more room for growth, and there's certainly more room for drug reform and criminal justice reform across the country. It's important to note that as law enforcement becomes more and more engaged with cannabis policy, and they better understand how the industry is also partnering in that process, they're learning a lot more, and they're starting to see, and have been for quite some time, seeing members of the industry more for the business role that they take on in the process versus like the former opinion that they had in terms of like, hey, are these folks that were operating in the criminal realm and now moving into the regulatory realm? And I think it's been really interesting to watch their perceptions evolve on the topic.
That's great. Yeah, that's encouraging to hear. Well, so getting back to, you were talking about your journey. Sorry to get you off track. So you mentioned now that transition into the, putting that regulatory hat on.
Yeah. So I work for the Colorado Department of Revenue, and it has an enforcement business group in it, and it's basically the chief regulators for casino gambling, liquor. They do a lot of stuff with off-track betting and horse track racing, but it also had casino gambling and then also cannabis. And all of those divisions that operate within the Department of Revenue have both a criminal justice role, but also a regulatory role. And they tend to focus more on the regulatory role than they do the criminal justice side of things. So I was in casino gambling in regulation early in my career. And in 2009, when we first started licensing businesses going into 2010, after the legislature passed a bill to start focusing on the commercial aspects of the medical cannabis industry, I transitioned into a new agency that had just been formed. And when that happened, my thinking at the time was, when does someone in law enforcement get to tackle forming a new agency, kind of tap in on their entrepreneurial spirit, which we're not known for, by the way, as regulators, but be able to kind of really tap in on that and form a new agency where one didn't exist before. And so that was kind of my original thinking. And when I think back on that, I was probably, not thinking as clearly as I could have, because it ended up being actually starting to formulate a whole new industry. And the work that we did in Colorado ended up being a roadmap for a lot of other states that would later on go and legalize cannabis. So I was really fortunate to be the director of that agency by the time legalized sales started. So I was largely responsible for formulating the teams that wrote all of the original regulations, but I was also responsible for putting together a lot of different public-facing work groups and meetings to help get more information from interested parties to help inform that regulatory policy. So I did that for a number of years. I was with the medical marijuana enforcement division, and then ultimately the marijuana enforcement division after legalization of cannabis. Late in 2016, going into 2017, I left state service because I was really fascinated by all of the work that I'd been able to be part of in Colorado. And I wanted to join forces with somebody else out of Governor Hickenlooper's administration. And we basically travel around the country helping states and local jurisdictions formulate a lot of their policy. During that time, we later in after the first year or so, we started taking on some private clients that worked kind of in the peripheral of cannabis or were interested in working in the peripheral of cannabis. One of those ended up being Metrc, and as Metrc was continuing to grow and expand its footprint, helping government form credible regulated frameworks, it just made more and more sense for me to join the company full time. So in early 2019, I started off first as the chief operating officer, and just here earlier this year, I became the chief strategy officer just a few short months ago.
Wow. It sounds like obviously there's tons of hard work and blood, sweat, and tears that go into where you're at today, right? But it sounds like everything really fell into place in terms of like how you mentioned your overall background and how it led you to the cannabis industry, which is one of the, if not the most highly regulated industries, right? And then moving on to not only helping to form and shape policy for the medical program in Colorado and eventually adult use, but then, being that consultant, basically traveling around and helping other states consulting. And you're the guy that I always talk about basically on this podcast, where I'm like, hey, this is such a burgeoning industry where these states have to be talking to one another in terms of best practices, right? So what was that experience like working with other states, and any kind of, notable things come out of those discussions or things that really stood out to you in that process?
Well, one thing I've always tried to do when I start learning another jurisdiction is be really open to a lot of the nuances and the specifics that are or the dynamics that are occurring in that particular area. We're always looking at problems, policies, and politics, right, to better understand what the best solutions are going to be, and that the political arms of government are willing to accept. And so it was really fascinating going from Colorado and then doing some work in some other states, and even like focusing a little bit more on things that are important to local jurisdictions, to get a much broader view of not just how we built the policies in Colorado, but how those policies might impact other jurisdictions differently. And so it was definitely a fascinating experience, and it really helped me learn a lot more broadly about effective public policy, but also like what I'm really passionate about. When you take a look, like all those experiences that we talked about, what I'm really passionate about is that interface between public policy and private business and all of the other stakeholders that exist around those two entities, and how you can bring those all together in a really effective way to create public policy that first and foremost protects public health and safety, but also provides for a really sound business environment where companies operating in space can be successful, right? We want cannabis businesses to be successful because we think it provides a much better alternative to a business environment that is strictly labeled as criminal.
Right. It sounds obvious when you mention like looking at it, like how you said you're really passionate about public policy and how that interfaces with private companies. And that makes the most sense to look at it through that lens, because the public policy that you're developing will then of course impact those operators, those businesses, which will then impact consumers. Am I speaking super obvious, or is this kind of a unique lens that y'all are looking at it from?
Well, so that's the fun thing about poli-sci, right? And public policy is like oftentimes the problem seems so obvious and the solution seems so obvious, but when you start getting engaged with a larger number of stakeholders in the process, you recognize it's not always that simple, right? Because if you do, let's just say, for example, we say you have to have really detailed packaging on cannabis, and you have to have this specific universal symbol, and you have to have it done in 2 weeks, right? The businesses are like, wait a second, first of all, it takes me 6 months to get new packaging in, right? So I can't do that, and so I think what's really important is, and like it is as simple as it sounds, it's like really understanding all the different viewpoints, so you can figure out ways to bridge the gaps. What I think oftentimes happens in what makes public policy somewhat adversarial, right? Like, I mean, come on, like public policy is like almost always seems adversarial in some way, shape, or form. But
Sure.
what I think can like bridge some of those gaps is when you create environments where stakeholder groups that would normally talk just to themselves. So law enforcement just goes over here and like, this is going to be a disaster and it's not going to work and it's going to impact public health and safety. And businesses are over there and like, the regulators are going to like create public policy that make our lives miserable. We're not going to be able to afford any of this. And you start bringing all of them together. There's an opportunity for one, for everyone to be heard. Two, for people to start to recognize things that they didn't necessarily recognize, that kind of pulls them away from their most passionate like components or biggest concerns.
Right.
And then they start educating one another, and you see that, and when you see that happen, that's kind of like where the magic really occurs, and you start seeing balanced public policy that can do just what I said. It's entirely possible, because we've seen it, where cannabis policy can first and foremost be designed in such a way where public health and safety is a priority, not just of government, but of the industry. Right. And that it can be done in an environment where the businesses can be successful. And I know, like, and by the way, it's not lost on me, like that a lot of businesses in the cannabis industry are struggling, right? Like, and that it, like the economic conditions are far from ideal right now. So I'm not trying to like pave past that, but there are ways, and we have seen it done, where the regulations aren't necessarily the primary driver of the downturn or the challenges that the businesses are facing.
Right. I was going to save this for later, but since it's relevant, I'll bring it up now. You know, when you talk about bringing people in and, you know, having them, you know, not be as focused as what they're so passionate about, and considering other pain points from other viewpoints and different perspectives, is this possible at the federal level? You know, I mean, the Senate just announced the COAO. You know, it's very hot topic right now. I mean, is this possible federally?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I'd like to say it's possible. Remember, I talked to you earlier about problems, policies, and politics, right? So for you to see windows of opportunity for change in public policy, you have to have like like on the problem side of things, you have to have like pretty general recognition that there's a problem, right? And I think I heard you talk with Congresswoman Mace earlier, and she's saying, hey, this isn't a controversial issue. And I think, like, to a certain extent, she's absolutely correct. Like, the problem, there is public opinion that would suggest that legalization is pretty straightforward, right? Like, most people think that legalization in like correcting or fixing that disparity between federal law and state law is a great idea. So the problem aspect of this is certainly like trending in the right direction towards legalization. So when you have that, you have a lot of people on the policy side of things that are trying to solve the problem. So these are the problem solvers, right? There's your lobbyists, your big businesses, the cannabis industry associations are all kind of like converging on this issue to try and figure out like what the solutions are to those problems. And then what they have to do next is convince the political arm of government, which we know not to be monolithic in any stretch,
not at all,
but in any way, shape, or form, to come together. So when all three of these are coming together, that's when you have your biggest opportunity for change. And what we don't know is whether or not that window that's open by all three of those streams converging on DC right now is big enough for major reform and legalization of cannabis federally, or if it's more primed for incremental change. And I think that's what we're really trying to pay attention to. So I do think all three of those influencing streams are certainly like all coming together in DC right now. I do think we're going to see at a minimum some incremental change, but every day we get closer to those midterm elections, the chances of even incremental change are probably becoming less and less. That doesn't mean that the conversations that we're having right now about COAO and some of the other bills with safe banking and the research bills and stuff like that, let's just say they don't get passed this year. Those are still very, very important conversations because they're more than likely to shape or at least be the starting point for conversations after the midterms. And then I think everybody we're talking to in DC, like everybody, like on both sides of the aisle, kind of feel pretty strongly that, that history is going to repeat itself and that there's a strong chance that the Republicans will take back the House. And then there's also like a likelihood that they could end up taking the Senate. So whatever ends up happening will need some level of Republican support for it. And we're starting to see that kind of support from a cohort of Republican congresswomen and men who are pretty focused on this issue. So the short, like I could have answered this by saying, yeah, sure. But there's sort of potential. It's just a question of whether or not it's going to be more incremental or more of a sea change towards full legalization. And then there's all sorts of other issues that we have to think about, right? Like what kind of federal policy could be harmful to the businesses that exist in the U.S. right now? In particular, interstate transfer is certainly something that is an issue, right? And if we only focus on things like licensing, monitoring, taxation, and regulation, and we don't focus on some of the other things like social justice and criminal justice reform, and I think there's some stakeholders too, like restorative justice concepts. Like those are all things that are important to a lot of the stakeholders that exist in the ecosystem, and those can be a little bit more controversial than just legalization itself. And so, sure, because those, not that they're not important, because they are, but they could like start to create some divisions that could slow down progress at the federal level.
Yeah, no, it's a long-winded answer, but it's a good answer. It really touches on everything that I was wanting to get out of, honestly. And the way you put it, when you talk about the streams of influence or those influence streams, that makes so much sense, right? I mean, there's those three that you mentioned, and they're all kind of slowly converging together. We're seeing momentum, right? And I get it. It's not, in my view, I think it's going to be incremental change, right? There's so many layers, as you've mentioned, in complexity to this, to the reform, social equity, social justice, along with regulatory issues. It's going to take time, right? And they're going to have to bite it off in small doses. But the way you put it is great. Okay, so I want to shift gears now, Louis, and I want to talk to you, I mean, I guess just more broadly about the importance of regulatory systems in cannabis. I mean, we obviously know that it's federally illegal, so there is no regulatory enforcement at the federal level, which is why Metrc is hyper-focused at the state level. So, tell us why it's important to have these regulatory systems in place, and then, maybe segue into how Metrc really adds value in this area of the industry.
Yeah. I think when we talk about creating a regulatory framework for cannabis, one of the promises that government's making to consumers is that they're going to provide safe products, right? And I also think too that we're also like really committed to providing a better alternative to criminal enterprises by bringing legitimate businesses into the mix. And I think a lot of that revolves around the ability of government to monitor efficiently the business practices, and there has to be some level of transparency from the business community towards the regulator, so that they can do the work that they need to confirm that all of those promises are being kept. So I think what's happened as regulatory frameworks have continued to pop up across the country and also evolve over time is we've landed on these licensing, taxation, monitoring and regulatory frameworks across the country, and they've been pretty comprehensive. Everything from pretty restrictive labeling requirements that we talked about earlier, packaging requirements, transparency of inventory, really robust testing requirements that taken various shape forms. So bottom line ends up being a comprehensive regulatory framework. And for that to really work well, again, we start talking about the importance of having like a good government business community relationship and a comprehensive regulatory structure. You really need to have ways to be able to report compliance efficiently. And one of the ways government has consistently across the board in the U.S. Address that challenge is through track and trace systems, where you have like the one part physical component of the tag that has important data that's affiliated with the inputs into the system, and the data on the tag corresponds with software. In our case, we also have a really robust support team and training function that goes along with all those things. But it's really important, and it's what it's proven is that it's possible for government to efficiently be able to regulate supply chains without creating massive disruptions to businesses. So they can actually do a lot of the monitoring for compliance right from their desktops while on the phone with a licensee. Or if they go to a cultivation, they're able to efficiently be able to inspect premises without having to move all the plants around. I'm sure you've been to a number of cultivations. Once the trellis system's in place, you can't move the plants around, but it's still important for government to have accountability on that product. Right. And so initially, well, I think there was a real focus on preventing inversion and diversion of cannabis to and from the regulatory framework. It's become something altogether different than that, right? It's become this incredible data set that government can use to inform a lot of decisions, but it's also been a really effective tool at creating a resilient supply chain where government can actually take product that's suspect or maybe making people sick and identify all the other product in the supply chain that is affiliated with that product and be able to efficiently determine whether or not it's also part of that same batch or that same problem. If it's not, then they can move it forward through the stream of commerce. If it is a problem, they can take it out and address it almost surgically.
This track and trace model that you mentioned, and I mean, is this specific to a certain industry that works regularly with the government, or is this standard basically is what I'm asking, and you're trying to adopt this model to the cannabis industry that's lacking federal regulation but getting ahead of it? Or
I would say it's the opposite. I would say cannabis as an industry is leading on this particular issue. In fact, if we didn't learn anything from COVID, we certainly learned that our supply chains are not as resilient as everyone thought they were. I mean, everybody that I know is waiting for something to come in that's on back order or is no longer being made. I mean, there was supply chain issues across the boards. And I would say that and this is actually one of the fascinating things about being part of the cannabis industry is suspect as the industry was, in 2008 or 2009, it's really blossomed into this industry that's leading in a couple of different areas. And I would say when it comes to supply chain resiliency, it's absolutely leading on that. Our company works in 22 different jurisdictions right now. So 20 states plus Guam and DC, where we work with government, where we provide government with a track and trace software system. And then businesses can either put their inventory data directly into Metrc, or they can use their legacy systems that they already use to move data back and forth into Metrc. But the end result is that government has a database that of consistent inputs coming from various players in the industry, cultivations, distributors, testing facilities, stores, manufacturers. All that data is going into and collected in a consistent way into one database that the government can rely on to monitor for compliance, but also help inform future policy and also identify potential public health and safety risks in stride with their normal business, and do it in a way that is efficient for government and efficient for business at the same time.
That's great to hear that cannabis is really leading in that area in terms of collecting, leveraging data, and how we're kind of shining as an example for other industries in that area. So thanks for clearing that up. When you talk about tagging, I know that Metrc relies on a mix of RFID enabled hardware. So is that really a major component of that tagging process and the transparency among the government?
Yeah, so Metric's pretty unique in the way it addresses tagging. So like I mentioned earlier, every track and trace system has a physical tagging component to it, and a software that interfaces with the data that's affiliated with each individual tag. So that's pretty universal. Even in areas that I've been in, I like tagging is something that almost every cultivation does, because there's data that they need from each individual plant that they follow, whether it's the strain or the date that it was planted, or other nutrients that they put on it. Whatever the case is, tagging is pretty universal in particular in cultivations, but also in other areas. So our system, what we do is because we have been entirely focused on first working with government for them to help set up the systems that they need to be efficient, and then also working with businesses in the licensee community to create streamlined workflows for them to be able to get data into the system. But since we were focused initially on government, we were also really focused on trying to create a tag that was much more difficult to be counterfeited. So I can't just draw a bunch of UIDs or unique identifiers out of my system and put it on a set of tags, and then also put it on another set of tags. All the tags that we have are provisioned into the system by Metrc and shipped out to business licensees. In all of those tags is an RFID chip that allows regulators to be able to do their inspections really efficiently. So if I go into a large grow of 4,000 or 5,000 plants as a regulator, and I want to do an inventory, I can usually do an inventory on a grow like that in a matter of an hour or so, versus like having to scan and get really close to a barcode. Our system can read our readers can read the RFID information from up to 21 feet away. And so it really creates some efficiency. So when we start thinking about what the future of our product looks like, we certainly recognize that there is a lot of potential for businesses that already use RFID tags for purposes of reporting to also be able to leverage that same technology. And so as we start looking into the future, that's certainly an area that we want to work with businesses on, so that they can also leverage the power of that technology for their system. What we know already is that a lot of businesses, especially smaller to mid-sized businesses, essentially use Metrc as their primary business system because it's really affordable and it's really robust. So if we could really turn some of that technology around to face towards the industry, we think that would be really beneficial to those small and medium-sized businesses that we really want to see survive and be sustainable over the long haul, and survive even things like federal legalization. And to do that, they have to be able to meet a lot of the compliance requirements and have a level playing field with the bigger companies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's talk specifically about Metrc's operations and, footprint in the various states that is operating in. So I think from your website, I clicked on one of the sales materials that it was like a 1 or 2 pager about what is Metrc. And I see that 15 billion in sales tracked. That's impressive. So, why don't you talk us through, your operations and really, where you're operating throughout the country?
Yeah. I've always tried to avoid naming all 22 jurisdictions, because more than likely I'm going to miss them. But I think what's important when you start thinking about the 15 billion in sales that we've tracked, the other numbers that I think are help better understand the scope of Metrc. I think there's well over 20,000 or more businesses, especially with us adding in Oklahoma here recently, that report data into the system on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. There's 300,000 individual users that have logins into Metrc that put data into the system on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. And the 22 jurisdictions that we're in are as big as California. So all of the regulated businesses in California report all of their inventory movements, testing, and sales all goes into that instance of Metrc for the government to be able to view. And then we also have programs that are as small as smaller programs like the one in Louisiana. And so we really like span all the way from the West Coast with Oregon and California and in the Rocky Mountain region there with Colorado and Nevada, all the way across the country to the East Coast, where we have states like Massachusetts, but we also have Missouri and Ohio, and so there's a lot of variation in what we have. But like what I think is important is of all the states that have track and trace, we're certainly the leading provider, both in number of states, but I think also too in number of businesses and unique users using our system.
As the chief strategy officer, what is Metrc? What's the strategy for the remaining of FY 2022 and beyond? I mean, what are you guys focused on?
So I think so there's a lot of things that we're focused on, right? One is cannabis legalization. Well, let me put it like the cannabis industry is fueled by changes in public policy, right? And so we're seeing some changes in public policy that certainly would suggest that the legalization effort is going to continue to grow and expand in other parts of the world. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that because we're spending a fair amount of time like really trying to understand what's happening in Europe right now. But also too, we're opening up our feedback loops to our customers and really re-engaging with third-party integrators that integrate with our system, which are several hundred different companies that cannabis businesses use, technology products that cannabis businesses use that integrate with our system. So we're really opening up the dialogue with integrators and providing new options for them here in the near future. But also too, we're really interested in better understanding as cannabis legalization grows and as the business needs and the business processes continue to evolve for those businesses, how we can continue to adapt Metrc to meet those needs. Again, the importance of the government regulated relationship and continuing to build that strong relationship. It's really important for us to be able to make it easier and easier and more effective and a better user experience for the cannabis businesses putting data into the system, so that the data that government gets on the other end to do their work more efficiently continues to get better and better. And so we certainly see ourselves focusing on products and enhancements to our system that make government more effective and the businesses more effective at reporting their compliance much more efficiently. And then of course too, like we're really, like I mentioned before, we're super interested in like how things expand across the globe. I'm part of my responsibility as the chief strategy officer is to really keep a close eye on the geopolitical landscape and how cannabis legalization is going to continue to expand around the globe. And certainly, I mentioned to you earlier, problems, policies, and politics. We're also looking for punctuated events that like
what's up with all the P's? What's up with all the P's, man?
Yeah, I'll have to like take a deep dive into that and like see if there's something wrong with me that those keep coming up. But I was going to say like that we are looking for like punctuated events. One of those certainly was earlier this year after the elections in Germany. They formed a new coalition that's a combination of the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the liberal Democrats, and they put it on their agenda to legalize cannabis. And so they essentially have 4 years to work through that process, and 1 year is 3/4 of the way done. So we're really watching closely how things continue to develop in Germany, because it could have a pretty significant impact on the pace at which adult use legalization expands throughout that continent. And so we're spending a lot of time better understanding the current medical market that exists and how that market might evolve over time if government decides that it's in the best interest of Germans or the best interest of other countries in Europe to move forward with more expansive, permissive cannabis policy.
Yeah, I did read about Germany. Are there any other countries that are really focused on cannabis reform at all, or even medical at this point in Europe outside of Germany?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that Germany is certainly the biggest market that put adult use on their agenda, but there's other countries too, like so Malta is an island just a little south of Sicily, in between Sicily and Cairo, I think is where it is. And it's a small country that's done some work towards legalization. It's a little bit more of a home grow model. And then we've certainly seen some progress in Switzerland, where they have an adult use beta project that they're going to be working on in the next year or two. And then Luxembourg, probably is one of the first European countries to declare that they're working towards, a medical or adult use market. So, well, the market's like probably right around 780 million for the EU member states right now. It's anticipated to grow to somewhere closer to 5 billion by 2025. And most people are suggesting that that's going to be through growth in the medical market, which has, like, we've seen medical markets grow just when the conversation around adult use starts happening. And so, it could, potentially get bigger if you have some larger markets expand and take on adult use legalization. But it's a whole new, it's all the same on one hand and a lot different on the other hand, the way things are playing out there, from importing and exporting between countries, having a disparity between a larger governing body, the EU, and this desire by member states of the EU to start looking at more expansive permissive cannabis policy. There's some that sounds familiar, doesn't it? But it's still going to play out completely different because of the way the policy is designed there.
Yeah, and given your career trajectory, it only seems to make sense for you to move to the global policy reform stage at that point, right? I mean, you've seen it all at this point.
Yeah, I don't know that. Well, if I certainly haven't seen it all, I've definitely learned that this year, that things are going to play out differently. And I do think it's like a natural course for us to think, expanding geographically. We've been, I would say, like, very very, very fortunate the way things have played out in the US, for us to have played such an important role in the legalization of cannabis in the US. There's certainly some lessons learned that can be applied in other jurisdictions, but there's also some things that we really have to learn, to continue to build the system to meet those unique needs of various jurisdictions. I mean, it's worth noting, now, given the fact that we have so many repetitions, like, coming up on 22 implementations of cannabis policy across the country, we've continually built new functionality into the system. And so as we go from one state to the next state, it becomes a little bit more, a little easier and a little bit more efficient for us to get our system set up, because we've got all these configurations in our system that can be turned on and off to meet the various nuances and public policy from one state to the next. And so we really want to build off of that as opportunities continue to expand around the globe.
Absolutely. Well, exciting things that Metrc is definitely focused on for the remainder of this year and beyond: global expansion, system integration, enhancements, and extending your footprint throughout the country and eventually globally. So Louis, really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your insights. I want to give you the floor. Is there anything that you want to touch on or that we haven't discussed before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like one thing that I would really like to talk about, is the importance of seeing cannabis legalization, or the public policy around legalization, continue to evolve. And as a company, we want to continue to evolve with that. And one thing that we're really putting at the forefront and putting a lot of time and energy into, which is also part of my job as the chief strategy officer, is continually looking for ways for us to be more sustainable, but also like find ways in which we can help and assist in the entire industry focusing on sustainability. And so one of the things that we've done internally on our end is, we talked about our tags, and having a tag that's resilient and withstands the rigors of a cultivation is not the easiest thing in the world to design. And so we as we've continued to expand, our footprint in terms of sustainability is becoming more and more important. And so we're working right now on putting on a tag that's actually in the final phases of testing, that's going to be built or that's going to be constructed from part like hemp products, and recycled consumer paper, and then also paper from sustainable sources. I'm really excited. We're getting close to being able to launch that and start putting that into production here towards the end of this year. And so it'll change, from having, tags that have, X amount of plastic into it to a third less material generally, and considerably less plastic utilized in the tag. So we're really excited about that. And then we're also, excited about other ways that we can help industry, track things like the pesticides that they use, or the nutrients, the amount of water and energy, are all things that, we would love to talk with industry members about more, so that we can report on that to show that the industry is actually sustainable and being good stewards of the opportunity to participate in the market, but also being good stewards of the environment.
Absolutely. And I mean, what an amazing plant, right? I mean, you're creating a tag off of the plant itself, the hemp paper, as you mentioned, hemp plastic, super sustainable, environmentally friendly. It's an amazing plant, Lewis. And that's super innovative that you guys are doing that. Congratulations on that. That's
yeah,
cool.
Thanks. Well, we really appreciate being on. One of my favorite things that you said, and I'll leave you with this, is that was a really long-winded answer, and I wish that was the first time I had heard that today. So I'll take that to heart.
I meant no disrespect from that. I meant that was
great.
Good, because there was so much to digest from it. And but you're super knowledgeable, and I really appreciate, your insights. Your experience is invaluable, and I'd love to have you back on as, more states come online, adult use, and you're interacting with those states from a regulatory perspective. Let's talk, Lewis. That'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. I'd love to be back on the show and visit with you again. This was great.
Awesome. Where can people find y'all's website and social media if they want to learn more about Metrc?
Yeah, so we're www.metrc, which is metrc.com, and you can find a lot of information on the website. And it's also very easy to find me out on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to accept new connections, and also really always happy to talk with anyone about cannabis generally, but also happy to talk about Metrc and ways in which we can prove and really support businesses and government as we continue to see this expansion of legalization occur.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lewis. And thank you all for listening. Bye.